There's something about certain towns that makes you feel like time forgot them. Places where every porch light casts long, suspicious shadows and every friendly wave feels a second too slow. That's how Ashford feels. Not the one in England, not the suburb outside Atlanta. No, this Ashford is a speck of a town tucked into the folds of northern Vermont. Population 2,108, give or take. A quiet place. The kind of place where people still leave their keys in their ignition at the general store, and the cashier knows your blood type before your last name. It's the kind of town where bad things aren't supposed to happen. But in January of 2019, contractors renovating an old colonial off Route 36 found something in the basement that changed that belief forever. They were 2 days into demolition, cutting through mildew-blackened drywall in what used to be a root cellar when the blade of a reciprocating saw hit something that wasn't stone or wood. It made a sharp clang, metal on metal. Behind a thick false wall built decades earlier, they found a sealed cavity, and inside that cavity, a crib. It was half-rotted, painted pale blue, though time and moisture had stripped most of the color. It sat crooked on rusted wheels. A delicate mobile of tarnished moons and stars hung above it, motionless in the cold air. Inside, the mattress was long decayed, but not empty. There were bones, small, human, wrapped in what appeared to be a once white blanket, now reduced to a stained swath of cloth around brittle ribs and a fractured skull no bigger than a grapefruit. The Vermont State Police were called. So was the medical examiner. The property, belonging to a Mildred Harper until her death in 2004, was sealed. Rumors started immediately. Some said it was a miscarriage covered up. Others whispered darker theories of sacrifice or imprisonment or worse. But it wasn't until 2 weeks later, when cleaning crews combing through the attic discovered an old cedar chest, that the case took its first real step forward. Inside that chest, underneath stacks of yellowed birth certificates, church pamphlets, and what looked like handwritten sermons, was a diary. It was bound in green leather, its pages brittle, its ink fading but legible, and it belonged to a woman named Clara Bell Harper, Mildred Harper's daughter, a daughter no one in Ashford remembered. This case would come to be known grimly as the Crib Wall Burial. And what unfolded after the diary's discovery would unravel a secret going back over 40 years, a secret that passed through generations, protected by fear, sealed by silence. This is a Macabre record. I'm your host, and this is the story of the Macabre crib sealed in the basement wall, and the diary that revealed who slept there. Ashford, Vermont, doesn't produce many public figures. It's the kind of place where family lineage matters more than what you've done. And in Ashford, no name carried more quiet reverence than the Harpers. The Harper family home sat on 6 acres of frozen pasture land, hemmed in by pine woods and the hushed breath of the Green Mountains. The house was large by Ashford standards, a colonial with white-clappered siding, green shutters, and a widow's walk no one had used in years. It was built in 1896. It had seen births, deaths, and decades of silence. Mildred Harper was, for most of her life, the town's moral compass. She taught Sunday school at St. Julian's Episcopal for 28 years. She chaired the Ladies' Quilting Circle and led prayer groups during the Gulf War and after 9/11. Her voice was measured, soothing. She never married, never raised children publicly. But if you ask anyone over the age of 50 in Ashford, they'll say the same thing. Miss Harper was the kind of woman who made you sit straighter. You didn't lie to her. You didn't curse around her. She wasn't cruel, just unwavering. Lois Dandridge, retired librarian, interview recorded February 2019. She was respected, admired, and terrifying in her moral clarity. Her estate passed into limbo after her death in 2004. No next of kin, no will. The property sat empty, locked behind an iron gate, slowly consumed by ivy. The town took possession quietly, letting the house decay in stillness for over a decade. Then came Clara Bell Harper. Her name was unknown until the discovery of that diary. In fact, there were no public records tying Mildred Harper to any children, no birth announcements, no school photos, no medical paperwork. And yet, the green leather diary in the attic was indisputably hers. Inside the front cover was a line written in cursive, firm and neat. "This diary belongs to Clara Bell Harper, born August 17th, 1975, daughter of Mildred." It wasn't just the name that shocked investigators. It was the voice within the pages, a girl's voice, growing older year by year and eventually more troubled, more fragmented. But we'll come back to Clara. First, let me tell you about Reverend Paul Winslow. Because to understand the Harpers, you have to understand the church they gave their lives to. Reverend Winslow came to Ashford in 1969, just months before Clara's birth. A lean man with a strong chin and deep-set eyes, Winslow preached hard truths in soft tones. He ran St. Julian's with discipline and precision. He was close to Mildred, very close. If she was the spine of the town, he was its mouthpiece. On Ruth Edgerton, church member, audio interview from 2020 together, they promoted a strict doctrine of purity and self-denial. Sin, in their eyes, was not just moral failure, it was a sickness. And children were not exempt. People say the church changed in the 70s, became colder, harsher. Rumors began to surface of private meetings, prayer sessions lasting deep into the night. But again, nothing ever proven, not until the diary. And not until contractors found that crib sealed inside the basement wall. The crib, the bones, the diary, and the Harper name, once whispered in reverence, now spoken only behind closed doors. What happened to Clara Bell Harper? Why was her name erased from history? And whose bones lay in that blue-painted crib? The story was only beginning. If Ashford had a gossip mill, it churned slowly, like molasses in January. But when it came to the Harpers, even whispers rarely escaped. Yet they were there, in slips of conversation at the general store, in shared glances during Sunday services. There were those who remembered Clara, not by name necessarily, but in fragments, a shadow in a memory, a child seen briefly through a curtain. One such memory came from Margaret Keeley, now 71, who once lived 2 doors down from the Harpers. "I never saw a child, not properly, but I remember toys. A doll carriage on the porch one summer, a stuffed bear drying on the clothesline, and once a lullaby playing from the basement window. It was faint, but it was there." Margaret Keeley, personal interview, March 2019. Keeley asked once, innocently, if Mildred was watching a relative's child. She was met with a cold stare, and the statement, "That part of the house is off limits." That should have been strange. But this was 1980s Vermont. People respected boundaries, even when they made no sense. Still, more fragments surfaced. Cynthia Barnes, a now retired pediatric nurse, recalled an unusual encounter from 1983. She had recently taken a part-time position offering in-home wellness checks in rural areas. One request came, anonymously, on crisp church-embossed stationery. It said only, "Check on the child, Wednesdays after 3, no questions." There was a $50 money order enclosed. Cynthia Barnes, interview via phone, April 2019. She went. The Harper home was immaculate. The woman who answered, Mildred, spoke with firm, polite insistence. Cynthia was led not into a nursery, but a small upstairs bathroom. There, she found a girl, pale, thin, maybe 8 years old, dressed in what looked like a christening gown. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Her hair had been cut short like a boy's. She had bruises, not fresh but healing, around the wrists, ankles. I remember thinking they looked like pressure marks from restraints. When Cynthia tried to ask questions, Mildred's voice changed. It became cold, sharp. She said, "The child is under the Lord's care. You will do your task and leave. If not, the sheriff will be informed." Cynthia never returned. She didn't report it. She should have, and there were others. A local mailman, Roger Kemp, remembered delivering padded envelopes to the Harper home, labeled with unfamiliar return addresses from New Mexico, Oregon, even rural Canada. A plumber hired in 1992 to repair a leak in the basement noted something that chilled him: a second door, sealed behind plaster. He was told not to touch it. He didn't. None of this made a complete picture. Not yet. But the final red flag, perhaps the most disturbing, came in 1998, 6 years before Mildred's death. A young man named Elias Dorr, an intern at the county records office, was tasked with digitizing old birth records. As he leafed through fragile paper entries, he stumbled upon a file labeled Clara B. Harper, Live Birth, August 17, 1975. The file was marked Classified, Do Not Scan. It had a handwritten note clipped to it, signed by Reverend Paul Winslow, under ecclesiastical seal, authorized concealment granted per 1976 clergy provision. Dorr asked about it. He was quietly dismissed from his position a week later. He never spoke about it until 2019, after news of the diary broke. I knew something was wrong. I didn't push. I regret that. Elias Dorr, statement submitted via affidavit, April 2019. And so, the puzzle remained. A child remembered by no one, and yet present in memory. A diary written in secret, and a crib, entombed behind a basement wall. The red flags were everywhere, and for years, no one looked. Clara Bell Harper's diary begins in 1982. The first entry is short. Just 10 words, written in cramped, looping letters. I am not allowed upstairs when mother is angry. The entries that follow, dated weekly at first, then monthly, form a chilling mosaic of a life lived in confinement. There are no mentions of friends, no holidays, no birthdays, just chores, prayers, punishments, and silence. June 3rd, 1983. Today mother gave me a book of Psalms to memorize. I made a mistake on 34:14 and was not allowed supper. I cried, but only a little. Crying is punished with the dark cap. July 12th, 1983. I asked about the music I hear through the floor. Mother says there is no music. She says the devil plays tricks when I am impure. The dark cap appears in over a dozen entries. Investigators believe it was a sensory deprivation hood, possibly sewn by Mildred herself. Clara describes being placed in the basement corner, blindfolded, for hours. In 1984, the tone shifts. Clara is 9. She writes less like a child and more like someone trying to maintain sanity. September 8th, 1984. I'm trying to remember my name, not the one mother gave me, the other one. I think someone called me Belle once. Belle sounds real. Clara sounds like a hymn. By then, the entries mention an object repeatedly. The crib, November 22nd, 1984. The crib is empty now, but sometimes it isn't. Sometimes I dream a baby is inside. It cries. I wake up with my hands bleeding from the nails. Her drawings, found tucked between diary pages, show what investigators later described as repetitive confinement symbols. Grates, locks, eyes watching from walls. One shows a girl standing inside the crib, far too big for it. Another depicts a figure outside the crib, faceless, holding a crucifix. The diary doesn't name Reverend Winslow directly, but he appears through euphemism. The Watcher, the Shepherd, the Voice in the Blue Room. February 14th, 1986. The Watcher says pain is the cost of being born wrong. He says I must earn the right to be seen. It's around this time that Clara stops referring to herself in the first person. The entries become clinical, dissociative. March 5th, 1986. The girl woke up with red marks on her back. She was bad in her dream. The shepherd corrected her. She was 11. Then, silence. No entries between March and December that year. When the writing resumes, Clara's tone is flat, emotionless. She describes days as shadows and repeats. The crib is gone, or maybe not. December 25th, 1986. There were no hymns today. The girl sat in the prayer box. The crib is part of her now. That was the last entry for 3 years. No one knows exactly what happened between 1986 and 1989. The attic chest contained no pages from that period, but what comes next is a single entry written in blue ballpoint, likely years later, on a scrap of lined paper tucked into the back of the diary. It's unsigned, but unmistakably hers. I think I died once. I don't remember how many times, but I know the crib was never mine. It was his. He watched me sleep there, even when I stopped sleeping. What does that mean? Who is he? Some investigators believe Clara was subjected to long-term psychological conditioning, possibly religiously motivated isolation, with physical abuse framed as spiritual discipline. Others believe there was a second child. The bones in the crib, estimated by forensic anthropologists to belong to an infant between 6 and 9 months old, were never definitively identified. DNA tests returned partial matches to the Harper line. Could Clara have had a sibling? Could she have mothered a child hidden away in that house and lost it? The diary doesn't say. But what it does make clear is this: for nearly 2 decades, Clara Bell Harper lived and suffered in near total isolation, hidden in plain sight beneath the floorboards of a town that called her mother a saint. And somewhere during those years, something unspeakable happened, something Mildred Harper went to her grave protecting. Sometimes it takes only a flicker to pierce years of darkness. In the Harper case, that flicker came from a neighbor's broken pipe and a long-forgotten manila envelope left in a county filing cabinet. The year was 2018. Mildred Harper had been dead nearly 14 years. Her house stood empty, bones quiet behind the basement wall. The case wasn't a case yet, just an old house left to dust and rot. But then came the flood. In August, torrential rain swelled the Black River, and water crept into the Harpers' long-abandoned basement. It wasn't enough to reach the upper floors, but it did trigger a town ordinance. Buildings on public rolls with signs of structural decay must be evaluated for safety. Ashford's tiny public works department hired an outside contractor, Vermont Restoration Group, to assess the house for mold and wood rot. The crew was unprepared for what they'd find. We spoke with Jonah Wells, the foreman on that crew. He still remembers the moment his apprentice, Luis Mendonza, brought him to the wall. It was strange. You could see the basement's back wall didn't line up. About a foot of space was just gone. Luis knocked on it, and it sounded hollow, so we cut in. Jonah Wells, interview recorded February 2020. They expected to find an old storage niche, maybe a dumbwaiter shaft. They didn't expect a sealed cavity lined with plastic sheeting. They didn't expect a crib. I thought it was a prank, Jonah told me. Then I saw the bones. I knew it wasn't. The team backed out. Authorities were called. Within 2 hours, Vermont State Police and a forensic anthropology unit from Burlington had locked the house down. The remains were taken to the office of the chief medical examiner. Initial examination confirmed the worst. Human infant bones. Approximate age, 6 to 9 months. No visible trauma, but signs of long-term post-mortem concealment. Evidence of tattered fabric, believed to be part of a blanket or baptismal cloth, and something else. Tucked between the mattress coils and the decaying frame was a pacifier, stamped with a date. May 1988. The public didn't learn any of this. Not yet. Police hoped to avoid a media circus while they worked to identify the remains, but they needed context. History. That's when Officer Sadie Trent began digging. She pulled property records, church rosters, burial permits, a needle in a haystack search. One late night, buried in a drawer labeled inactive cases. Prior to 2000, she found it. A manila envelope stamped Child Welfare Inquiry, 1988, Harper M. It contained only 3 pages, a complaint submitted anonymously, stating that a child's cries have been heard repeatedly from the Harper residence, even though no child is publicly known to reside there. A signed statement from Reverend Paul Winslow, attesting that Miss Harper is a woman of God and lifelong guardian to no minor at present. A rejection slip from the Vermont Department of Children and Families. No evidence to warrant further investigation. The complaint had been dismissed in 2 days. But now, 30 years later, those 3 pages became the ember, and the attic, long untouched, was next. On January 3, 2019, while photographing the house's interior for evidence cataloging, a crime scene technician noticed a dislodged attic panel behind an old cedar chest. Tucked inside, a photo album with pages ripped out, 5 yellowed church pamphlets, a child's drawing showing a woman standing over a crib, and the green leather diary of Clara Bell Harper. It was then, and only then, that the case broke wide open. The presence of the diary changed everything. This was no longer a potential case of infant abandonment or unreported stillbirth. It became, in the words of Vermont AG Rebecca Kerr, a sealed chamber of suffering, and possibly a cover-up of generational abuse. Forensic graphology confirmed the diary's authorship. The writings were consistent over nearly a decade, but the final entry, written in a different ink years later, hinted at an ending no one expected. He told me to forget her, that the Lord takes the impure, but I hear her in my dreams. I see the crib. I am not the only one who slept there. It wasn't just Clara's story now. It was someone else's. The bones, the pacifier. May 1988. Who was that child? And what really happened inside the Harper basement? One officer finally decided they'd waited long enough. She took the case to the state, and what she encountered next was resistance. You'd think that when human remains are discovered sealed behind a wall, accompanied by a child's diary describing years of confinement, every system would snap into motion. But in Ashford, the opposite happened. It's important to understand something about Vermont's rural jurisdictions. Resources are limited and institutions are tightly interwoven. Local clergy, town clerks, and law enforcement often share more than a zip code. They share loyalty to the town, to tradition, and, in some cases, to each other. When Officer Sadie Trent sent her report to the Vermont State Police's Cold Case Division in January 2019, she expected a call back within days. She had attached photographs of the crib, the remains, and excerpts from the diary. She had timelines, names, and a detailed reconstruction of property history. She received a one-line email reply: Reverend Winslow is deceased. No active suspect. Insufficient grounds to reopen past welfare cases. It wasn't just a deflection, it was a dismissal. Winslow had died in 2007, the same year St. Julian's closed its doors and fell into disrepair. The files held by the church, sermons, baptism logs, internal letters, had reportedly been lost in a fire during building renovations in 2008. The Department of Children and Families, DCF, was no more cooperative. When pressed about the 1988 complaint, they cited record retention policy. Due to statutory limits, records not tied to active cases are purged after 20 years. No further documentation remains. But Trent wasn't deterred. She reached out to Ashford's Historical Society, hoping to uncover newspaper clippings, yearbooks, anything to confirm Clara's presence in the community. The response: there is no record of a Clara Harper attending Ashford Public Schools. No mention in the yearbooks between 1980 and 1995. Email from Margaret Lenihan, archivist. This omission wasn't accidental. Clara had never been enrolled. Not in Ashford. Not anywhere in the state of Vermont. Then came the moment that chilled Trent most. A closed-door meeting with Ashford's then-mayor, Frank Bellamy, in February 2019. He told me, and I quote, "Let this one die in peace. The town's been through enough. That house already has ghosts." Sadie Trent, interview with Vermont Public Safety Board, May 2020. She asked if he was protecting someone. He only repeated, "There are things best left buried." It wasn't just bureaucratic drag, it was coordinated silence. There was also resistance from Mildred Harper's former congregation. Of the 28 surviving parishioners from St. Julian's who had attended regularly during the 1980s, only 4 agreed to interviews. One, Margaret Edgell, gave a cryptic but telling answer. Miss Harper believed in spiritual confinement, that souls could be corrected through silence. She said pain was a form of prayer. I think some of us believed her more than we should have. Trent documented all of this. But when she attempted to escalate the case to federal jurisdiction under potential unlawful confinement statutes, her report vanished from the system. Literally. The file she submitted to the FBI's Civil Rights Division, complete with diary scans, forensic analysis, and historic corroboration, returned an automated error. When she checked her own report system logs, the file had been accessed and archived without her authorization. A week later, she was placed on administrative leave. The reasons cited: emotional instability and unprofessional conduct related to unsanctioned case investigation. They took her badge. They thought that would be the end of it. But it wasn't, because Trent had already sent a copy of the full file, unredacted, to someone else. A local reporter, a man who'd grown up in Ashford, left for college and returned only after the Harper story began to echo through the quiet hills. His name was Caleb Rusk. And Caleb wasn't interested in protecting Ashford's secrets. He was ready to uncover them. Caleb Rusk was no stranger to quiet horror. He grew up in Ashford during the late 80s and early 90s, just a few miles from the Harper property. He remembers the snowdrifts taller than cars, the stillness of winter nights, and the way his parents' voices lowered whenever Mildred Harper walked into church. He also remembers the screams, faint, distant, always brushed off. My mom used to say it was just the foxes near the woods, but one night I said it didn't sound like a fox. I said it sounded like a baby crying. She slapped me, just once, but she looked scared. Caleb Rusk, from an unpublished memoir draft, 2020. By 2019, Caleb was a stringer for a regional paper in Burlington. He'd written pieces on opioid addiction in small towns, school board corruption, and one haunting story about a suicide cluster in a shuttered textile town. When Sadie Trent sent him the file, she included a voice message. "They're going to bury this, Caleb. I need someone outside the uniform to shine a light. This isn't just a forgotten child. It's an erased life." He read the diary, all 76 entries, and then he did something no one else had thought to do. He knocked on doors. He returned to Ashford and began re-interviewing the now aging neighbors. He recorded every conversation. When asked about the Harpers, most people still gave the same response: no child ever lived there. Miss Harper kept to herself. It's all gossip. But one man, Wendell Croft, broke the silence. Wendell was 84, mostly blind, and had lived 2 houses down from the Harpers for most of his life. He smoked hand-rolled cigarettes on his porch, even in the snow. I heard her, the little girl, for years. She used to hum through the vent on the north side of the house. My wife said it was the wind, but I knew the tune. "Nearer, my God, to thee," sang it like she didn't want to forget. Wendell Croft, interview transcript, March 2019. Rusk followed that lead. He photographed the vent. He traced it to what would have been the east basement wall, the same wall where the crib was found. He also found something buried in the Ashford Gazette archives, a 1988 issue with a one-sentence blurb. Ashford police responded to a domestic concern on Harper Hill Road Wednesday. No further action taken. The date? May 25th, 1988. Exactly 2 days after the manufacture date, stamped on the pacifier found in the crib. It was the first hard timestamp connecting a child's active presence in the home to the eventual remains. But Rusk didn't stop there. He dug into St. Julian's Church records. The fire in 2008 had destroyed much of the material, but a small box of microfilm reels had been mistakenly archived at the Vermont Theological Library. Inside those reels, he found sermon transcripts from Reverend Winslow, and among them, one entry dated June 5th, 1988. It reads, "There is no sin in silence, no wickedness in secrecy if the Lord ordains it. The lamb that cries without permission may invite wolves." Another clue surfaced in the margins, scrawled in unfamiliar handwriting, "CB. Failed again. Lord forgive. The crib must become the tomb." Rusk published his first expose in April 2019. It ran in the Burlington Weekly under the headline, "The Basement Crib, Secrets, Silence, and a Child Erased from Ashford." The article included quotes from the diary, the forensic evidence, and excerpts from Trent's now-suppressed report. It also named Reverend Paul Winslow and Mildred Harper as central figures in what Rusk described as a likely faith-driven containment of a child, possibly more than one, resulting in at least one death. The story went viral within 72 hours. National networks picked it up. Reddit threads exploded. People began driving to Ashford just to look at the house. Then came a second article. She wasn't the only one who slept there. New evidence suggests 2 children hidden in Harper home. And days, that second headline lit a fuse, because it was based on something Rusk uncovered late one night, combing through scanned baptism records from an affiliated church in nearby Leiden. A listing, barely legible. Infant blessing, March 1988. Name, Ephraim. Mother, Clara. No surname given. Performed by Reverend P. Winslow. The mother wasn't listed as Mildred, it was Clara, and that single entry cracked the case wide open. Rusk took it to the Attorney General. This time they listened. Within 2 weeks, a warrant was issued. The Harper house was officially declared a crime scene, and the basement, already full of secrets, was about to give up the rest. When the state finally moved in, they did so quietly. No sirens, no press. Just 4 unmarked SUVs pulling up to the Harper house on a grey morning in May 2019. This time, there was no one to stop them. No Mildred. No Reverend Winslow, just the house, and the lies it kept. Forensic teams spent 10 days on site. They used ground-penetrating radar, thermal mapping, and cadaver dogs. What they uncovered stunned even veteran investigators. The first discovery was architectural. Behind the basement's eastern wall, where the crib was found, was a hidden corridor, just under 4 feet wide. Sealed with plaster and drywall in layers, it stretched 27 feet beneath the main structure. No permits, no blueprints. Inside were the remnants of what can only be described as a makeshift living cell. A stained mattress on the floor, a chamber pot, a cracked porcelain sink connected to dry copper piping, a wooden chair with leather straps nailed to the arms, a rusted intercom system routed through the house's wall panels, and in the farthest corner, a second crib, smaller, untouched, covered in a shroud of dust and decay. But it wasn't the furniture that confirmed the deception, it was the paper. Inside a metal lockbox beneath the floorboards, investigators found 2 forged birth certificates, one for Clara Bell Harper, dated 1975, one for Ephraim Harper, dated 1988. Both issued under a defunct church-sponsored birthing registry called Graceful Entry Ministries, tied to a now-dissolved compound in New Hampshire. A ledger of spiritual disciplines, handwritten in black ink, each entry marking punishments by date and sin, referencing both Clara and E. The language was cryptic. Irresisted cleansing ritual. Isolate for 3 days. See sang without permission. Lashes 7. No water, 2 days. Correspondence between Mildred and Reverend Winslow, revealing the entire scheme. One letter dated March 1988. The birth has been completed. She will raise him in darkness until his voice aligns with the doctrine. I have blessed the water. The vessel is unclean, but redeemable. The deception wasn't limited to forged documents. Winslow and Mildred had used Graceful Entry Ministries, a fringe, unregulated religious group, as a legal smokescreen. The group promoted home births free from secular contamination and promised spiritual purification for impure lineage. Clara was never legally registered with the state. Her identity existed only through the church, which made her invisible. Ephraim, her child, was even more so. No state record, no medical file, no burial record. It was, by every definition, a deliberate erasure. Experts brought in to review the ledger described it as a manual for psychological and physical reconditioning under the guise of salvation. Psychiatrist Dr. Miriam Hale, who examined excerpts, called it textbook cultic isolation, a generational trauma structure weaponized through faith language. This wasn't discipline, it was devotion-driven abuse. Further DNA analysis confirmed what the diary and church records had implied. The remains in the crib belonged to a male infant. He was Clara's biological child, and the paternal match was Reverend Paul Winslow. The implications were catastrophic. A religious leader, fathering a child with a girl he likely helped imprison, a child who died before his first birthday, a death never reported, his body sealed inside a basement cavity like a forgotten possession. There was one more piece of the puzzle. In the diary's final pages, never published, never made public, Clara described a recurring dream. In the dream, I walk out of the house, I carry Ephraim, and we walk into the light. But when I look down, It's not him I'm holding, it's a book, and I can't let go. I wake up choking on hymns. Investigators believe she wrote that entry sometime around 1993. After that, the entries stop. No one knows exactly what happened to Clara. There are no death records, no sightings, no confirmed burial. But one thing is certain, she didn't leave the Harper house of her own free will. It's easy to call them monsters, those who imprison, indoctrinate, and abuse. But in Ashford, the horror was hidden not behind cruelty, but conviction. At the heart of the Harper house, and deeper still in the diary and the documents found beneath the floorboards, was a belief system, one shaped by religious extremism, buried doctrine, and warped theology dressed in righteousness. It wasn't just about sin, it was about purification. The ideology Mildred Harper and Reverend Winslow followed was an offshoot of something called penance doctrine, a fringe theological strain first documented in 1940s Appalachian sects. It held that children born of unrepentant vessels bore the stain of original sin not only in spirit but in body. To cleanse them, three things were required: isolation from the secular world, submission to the will of the ordained, pain, administered in the spirit of sanctification. But what made the Harper case so chilling was that this wasn't an old book locked away in a dusty church shelf. This was a lived system, built into the architecture of the house, etched into the routine of a child. In the handwritten ledger recovered from the hidden chamber, Mildred referred to the rooms by biblical code. The basement, the hollow of judgment; the bathroom, upstairs; the baptismal forge, Clara's chamber; the bell cage; the crib, the womb returned. According to the writings, Clara was viewed as a vessel of inversion, a child whose birth had defied the covenant of silence. That language, covenant of silence, appears again and again. Investigators found copies of typewritten pamphlets in the attic, most with titles like "When the Bloodline Betrays," "The Silence is the Offering," "Cradle of Salt," "How the Devil Creeps into the Mouth of a Babe." They were marked "Graceful Entry Ministries," a sacred order of postnatal redemption. There are references to trial rituals. Clara writes, at just 10 years old, "Mother says I failed the silence test. I asked for water too early. The shepherd said, if I want to be seen by the Lord, I must not exist to the world." It wasn't just that she was hidden, she was erased, spiritually and physically. When Clara gave birth to Ephraim, almost certainly a result of coercion by Reverend Winslow, his role in this belief system became even more perverse. Ephraim was labeled the returned vessel. One document refers to him as the fruit born of defilement. He must sleep in the cradle of reproof until the stain is gone. He must not be named beyond the litany. That litany was found. Scrawled in pencil across the inside of a closet wall, it reads, "Do not name the child. Do not feed the child without prayer. Do not rock the child without tears. Do not love the child before the 90th day. The Lord must first look away." Dr. Miriam Hale, trauma psychologist, called it a structured theology of withholding, where affection was a temptation and neglect was worship. The physical crib found behind the wall was not a piece of furniture. It was a spiritual cell, a place designed to break a child's will while sanctifying the parent's role as deliverer. Reverend Winslow's writings from 1988-89 suggest he believed Ephraim's death, whether intentional or through starvation or neglect, was a passage. The vessel passed through fire. The silence has been fulfilled. The mother is now ash. Glory be. It's believed this is a reference to Clara. The language, "the mother is now ash," strongly implies she may have been killed, and yet no remains matching her age or sex were found in or around the Harper home, only the faint imprint of her soul, etched in her diary. In her final pages, she writes, "They said the world would forget me, that I was born of sin and would die in silence, but I wrote this. And I am still writing. If someone reads it, I am not erased." That line became the closing quote of Caleb Rusk's expose. It appeared under her name on national broadcasts, And it proved one thing the doctrine never accounted for. Even the most sealed walls cannot hold back the truth forever. May 14th, 2019. 6:03 a.m. Ashford, Vermont was still asleep when law enforcement crossed the threshold of the Harper house under a full judicial warrant. Though the bones and diary had already been recovered months earlier, the full-scale forensic raid was sanctioned only after the ledger, letters, and underground room were made public in Caleb Rusk's second article. Public outcry followed. National attention pressed on what Ashford had tried to forget. Inside the house, a dozen agents worked in silence, stripping away decades of insulation, both literal and psychological. And what they found was worse than imagined. Behind the prayer room, concealed behind a false bookcase and bolted with steel, a narrow hallway lined with mirrors. They faced inward, some cracked, some smeared with what later tested positive for human biological material. The walls were scored with deep scratch marks. No handles, no windows, no light fixtures. Agents labeled it the corridor of reflection. One investigator reportedly vomited after walking through. At the end of the hall, a locked chest. Inside were several cloth dolls, each marked with initials on a stitched patch, CH, a W, MH, ST. One bore no initials, only the word spare. In the attic, a loose floorboard gave way to a crawl space, no more than 3 feet high. There, covered in canvas and mildew, they found a second unlisted diary. This one was not Clara's. The handwriting was smaller, more rigid, male. It was Reverend Winslow's. He had documented more than sermons. Within its brittle pages were exact details of Clara's progress, of the babe's trials, of his private visits to the Harper home. Dates matched hospital records from 1987 and 1988, where he had reported retreats to restore spiritual clarity. There was one entry, dated July 2nd, 1988, just over a month after Ephraim's estimated time of death. The vessel has failed. The silence was not held. Clara wept during the third rite. I feared contamination of the soul. I made her rest. I will report her as gone to the Lord. Investigators believe this was the moment Clara's life ended. No cause of death is listed, no burial recorded, no grave found. But in the fireplace, charred bone fragments were recovered beneath a false hearthstone. Testing confirmed human, female, approximately 17 to 20 years of age. No definitive ID could be made, but the timeline aligned. Down in the basement, authorities made one final, haunting discovery. Inside a second sealed compartment adjacent to the child's crib cavity, they found a cassette tape recorder. It was old, a GE P9930, covered in dust. Still had a cassette inside, labeled in marker, Silence, number 3. The audio, now preserved as evidence, is just over 32 minutes long. It contains the following: a child humming "Nearer, my God, to Thee," rhythmic breathing, the unmistakable cry of an infant, a voice, deep, male, whispering the phrase, "Only silence can be saved." Then, nothing. No more crying. Just 30 seconds of tape hiss, then the click of the recorder stopping. That tape became the single most damning piece of physical evidence tying the theology of pain directly to Ephraim's death. When presented with the full findings, the Vermont State Attorney General issued a formal statement. What occurred in that house was a systematic effort to erase lives under the mask of faith. It represents a tragic failure of institutions, of accountability, and of basic human decency. A.G. Rebecca Kerr, May 30th, 2019. All remaining property of St. Julian's was seized. The Graceful Entry Ministries registry, though technically defunct, was placed under federal review, and the Harper house was boarded up under 24-hour surveillance. Later, it would be burned to the ground under court order, deemed too psychologically hazardous to be repurposed or sold. But long before that fire, before the boards were nailed shut, before the front gate sagged on rusted hinges, the town had already started burying it again. The law moves slowly, but grief lingers. By July 2019, the Harper property had become the center of a growing legal and moral reckoning. But in the courtroom, ghosts are hard to convict. With both Mildred Harper and Reverend Paul Winslow long deceased, there were no living primary suspects to prosecute for the crimes unearthed at 421 Harper Hill Road. No arrests, no perp walks, only documents, bones, and a house steeped in silence. Still, the Vermont State Attorney's Office moved forward with a multi-pronged strategy. They targeted the enablers, those who, knowingly or not, contributed to Clara and Ephraim's erasure. The civil suits for former officials, 2 from the Department of Children and Families and 2 from Ashford's Municipal Oversight Board, were named in civil litigation for gross negligence resulting in preventable death. The suits alleged that the 1988 child welfare complaint was improperly dismissed and that the town had ignored red flags across decades. Depositions revealed a damning pattern. DCF workers who admitted they had no training in cult-identifying behavior. A town clerk who claimed she had been discouraged from investigating property anomalies related to the Harpers. One witness anonymously confessed, "We all knew something wasn't right, but you didn't question Mildred Harper. You just didn't." The civil suits settled quietly. 3 of the 4 defendants paid undisclosed sums to a fund created in Ephraim's memory, administered by the Vermont Center for Missing and Exploited Children. But justice, in its purest form, remained elusive. There would be no convictions, no trials, no names on prison rolls. The grand jury inquiry. In November 2019, a grand jury was convened to consider whether any other individuals, possibly affiliated with Graceful Entry Ministries, could be charged under federal conspiracy statutes. The results? Sealed, but sources close to the investigation confirmed that several sealed indictments were issued. Among the unconfirmed names were a midwife who had worked in Leiden during 1988 and a former associate pastor from a splinter church tied to the theology behind the Harper doctrine. No extraditions were made, no public charges were announced. The cult, if it still existed, had evaporated, leaving behind only scorched doctrine and unanswered questions. Forensic psychology and the question of Clara. Perhaps the most painful element of the entire case was the absence of a definitive identity for the girl who wrote the diary. Though forensic evidence linked the remains in the hearth to a female estimated between 17 and 20, degraded mitochondrial DNA made confirmation impossible. Without surviving family members, no match could be made. Dr. Eliza North, a trauma psychologist brought in to review Clara's diary in its entirety, presented findings at a public symposium in early 2020. Clara exhibited signs of severe childhood complex PTSD, dissociation, and internalized spiritual abuse. Her writing reveals a girl robbed not only of freedom, but of identity. She was conditioned to believe her suffering was sacred. That's not just trauma. That's a hijacking of the soul. Dr. Eliza North, speaking at Dartmouth Forensic Psychiatry Conference. Dr. North concluded that Clara's psychological profile matched the experiences of victims of long-term cult confinement, especially those born into isolated religious environments. When asked if Clara could have survived, she said only if someone had intervened, but no one did. The town of Ashford, fractured public opinion in Ashford fractured. Some wanted to move on. Others wanted the town to reckon with what it had allowed to fester behind manicured hedgerows and Sunday sermons. A town hall meeting in March 2020 devolved into shouting, finger-pointing, and eventually walkouts. One resident, middle-aged and visibly shaken, spoke into the mic. "I passed that house every day for years, and I never saw her, not once." How does that happen? By the time winter returned, local efforts to preserve the Harper home as a historical site of reckoning were abandoned. Public pressure and private grief demanded it be destroyed. In January 2021, the house was burned in a controlled demolition. Only the chimney remains, and the trauma still lingers. Caleb Rusk left journalism in 2022. He now works with a non-profit that supports survivors of religious abuse. He never wrote another investigative piece. When asked why, he simply said, "You don't come back from hearing a child whisper through a wall." Officer Sadie Trent, never returned to duty. She moved to Maine, changed her number, and declined all media interviews. But her name appears in the dedication of a book published later that year, For Sadie, Who Wouldn't Let Silence Win. Excerpt from the preface to A Crib Sealed in Prayer by Dr. Eliza North and Ephraim. He was buried anonymously in a child's plot in Burlington. The marker reads only, Beloved, Known. A vigil is held there every year on May 25th. No names spoken, just candlelight and silence. Ashford never put up a plaque. There's no memorial by the old church ruins, no candlelit tribute outside the lot where the Harper house once stood. The ground was reseeded with wild grass, the fence replaced, and for the first time in 40 years, no child cries from behind the walls. But that doesn't mean it's forgotten. Far from it. Because when you speak with the people who touched this story, those who read the diary, combed through the ash, and listened to the tape, they carry it with them. Every day, legacy in policy. In 2020, Vermont passed Clara's Law, a bipartisan child protection statute aimed at tracking and intervening in cases of long-term undocumented home confinement. It closed religious exemption loopholes for medical care and required all home births to be registered with a licensed practitioner within 72 hours. The law also created the Harper Registry, a confidential list of children reported missing but never officially enrolled in any form of public life. No school, no pediatric record, no tax ID. The law passed unanimously. Academic response. The case also changed the way scholars discuss fringe theology and spiritual abuse. Dr. Eliza North's book, A Crib Sealed in Prayer, is now required reading at multiple forensic psychology programs. It devotes an entire chapter to what she calls sacramental erasure, the phenomenon of spiritual justification for complete annihilation of identity. In a 2023 symposium, Dr. North stated, Clara didn't just survive trauma. She wrote it down. She carved it out of stone with a ballpoint pen. And in doing so, she broke the covenant of silence, community reckoning. In Ashford itself, change is slower. The town remains split between those who want to bury the past and those who feel complicit in it. Some residents started a quiet initiative known as the Bell Keepers. They leave blank journals and pens on benches throughout the county, each bearing a single inscription on the cover. If you feel forgotten, write, you are not alone. More than 400 entries have been collected, some anonymous, some heartbreaking. One written in careful block letters read simply, She sang where no one heard her, I hear her now. The final entry. Though the original green leather diary was submitted to evidence, digital scans are kept in archival records. The final legible page, long thought to be too smudged to read, was partially restored using infrared imaging in 2022. Here's what it said. If someone ever finds me, tell them I was not a mistake. I was here. I saw the moon through the grate. I held my son. He was warm once. My name is Clara Bell Harper, and I remember love. Those were her last written words. Not scripture, not punishment, just a memory, a hope, a reach toward light. This story doesn't end cleanly. There are still questions that may never be answered. Was there another child? Were others complicit? Where exactly did the belief system begin, and has it truly ended? But some truths are clear. A child was born in secret, raised in silence, sacrificed on the altar of delusion. And yet, through ink and paper and a voice long hidden, she spoke. And we listened, because sometimes monsters wear polished shoes and smile at town meetings. Sometimes they hold hymnals in one hand and the lock to a cellar door in the other. And sometimes the loudest scream is the one that was never heard at all. In memory of Clara Bell Harper and Ephraim, beloved, known, and never forgotten. This has been a Macabre record. I'm your host. Thank you for listening.